tell me when you're ready. All good? Hey, well, good afternoon, everyone. Can I just say a very warm welcome to sunny Botany. Obviously, the big news of the day is our record high inflation result, our highest in over 30 years. In the middle of a cost of living crisis, inflation hitting 7%, the highest in 30 years, is a real worry for New Zealanders tonight, because the reality is they're worse off than they were 12 months ago. Their money doesn't buy as much as it used to, and as a result, they're going backwards under this Labour government. So it's incredibly worrying. The government will try and say it's due to overseas factors. It's just not true. We've got much higher levels of inflation than our trading partners, and importantly also domestic inflation has hit a record high, and that is what government can control. And for some time now, the OECD, the Reserve Bank Governor and the National Party has been saying to Grant Robertson, you're addicted to spending, you need to start reining it in, and that's exactly what needs to happen. With that, happy to take any questions you've got.
How would National bring down the cost of living?
Well, look, there's three things we need to do. Not pass costs on to business, rein in the spending and make sure it's not being wasted on things that aren't useful, and importantly remove bottlenecks for business like immigration and supply shortages. That's the big thing that we can do right now. But the biggest thing is rein in spending. And I can tell you that we've lost financial discipline in government at the moment. We've had a record increase in spending. Grant Robertson's planning to spend a record amount of $6 billion, the biggest amount we've ever had added to a budget in the history of New Zealand at a time, and it's just putting inflationary fuel on the fire, basically.
And what would National cut in order to...
Well, what we'll be doing right today is that Nicola Willis, as Finance Minister, will be directing every minister of every department to go through line by line to make sure that we're stopping the money being spent on wasteful programs that aren't having an impact, aren't getting results, and as a result making sure we're not wasting money. That's what Kiwis are doing tonight. They're going back around that kitchen table, working out how they deal with the rising cost of their mortgages if they're lucky enough to own a home, how they deal with a $150 increase in weekly rent, how they deal with a 7.5% increase in food prices, and how they deal with fuel at the pump. And so they have to adjust their own budgets, and all we're asking for is the government to say, hey, listen, think about the wasteful spending, think about the new spending that you've got on the table, and actually ask yourself, is that necessary? Is that adding fuel to the fire?
So what about scrapping a public holiday?
Sorry?
Is the government to blame for the cost of living crisis?
Absolutely. There are things that this government can be doing. They'll try and blame it and say there's a lot of things around overseas factors, and that's true. There is a component of that. But New Zealand has a higher inflation rate at 6.9% than Australia. And the Prime Minister yesterday was in Singapore, today she's in Japan. They have infinitely lower inflation rates in New Zealand. They face the same global factors. And so domestic inflation is a big part of our total inflation. It's at a record high of 6%, the highest since records have been created. And all of that's to do with a government that's addicted to spending. And for months now, we've been saying, hey, listen, start reining it in. The OECD said to Grant Robertson, start reining it in. And you heard from the Reserve Bank Governor this week saying exactly the same thing.
Is it okay that Kiwis are facing skyrocketing prices across the board?
No, it's not okay. And as I say to you, the government has to take responsibility for the spending that is driving into domestic inflation.
So does this mean that you might scrap a public holiday if you become Prime Minister?
No, the point I was trying to make yesterday is once a public holiday's passed, we ain't unwinding a public holiday. Just to be really clear about that. But as that public holiday is being created through legislation in the Parliament, it's quite right to ask the question now, because we won't get a chance to do it later, is do we want to add $450 million of extra cost to businesses in New Zealand? Because when you do that, they have to pass that through with higher prices, which drives through to inflation at a time when we have record high inflation and a cost of living crisis.
Was it a wise decision to joke about that on the radio?
I wasn't joking about it. What I was saying very clearly, and what we've been saying as the bill has been going through the Houses of Parliament, or the House of Parliament, is to say, is this actually an expenditure we want to be passing through? Because now's the time to ask the question. Once it's passed, we're not unwinding a public holiday.
It's off the table?
We're not unwinding a public holiday once it's been passed, but we are right to ask the question now, is it the right thing to do in this part of the economic cycle to add $450 million worth of cost to businesses when today we've just hit record inflation again?
You speak about the government reining...
Sorry, I'll just go here and I'll come back.
What practical measures do you think the government is taking to take it?
Well, look, right now, the biggest thing they can do is actually get financial discipline back into what they're doing. Over the last few weeks in my questions with the Prime Minister, I've been highlighting the money that we've been spending and the absence of results or outcomes that we've been getting for that investment. And so we need to be really intentional about making sure that when we spend the money, we get outcomes. And inevitably, in a government that's increased government spending tremendously over the last 4 years, about to add another $6 billion, the biggest in the history ever of New Zealand, there will be wasteful spending and all of that. And Bill English and Nicola Willis, they would be directing the ministers of every department to go through and say, hey, listen, let's just do what everyday Kiwis are doing, which is going through their expenses line by line and saying, what can I afford to do now? What's getting a return? What's having a big difference? And cancel the stuff that's not doing that. Sorry, you asked a question.
You speak a lot about, the government reining in their spending. What immediate changes need to be made? Give me some examples. What does that look like?
Well, here's a couple of good examples. We spend $100 million subsidising a slow train from Hamilton to Auckland. It's a lovely idea. A lot of us like riding on trains, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, $100 million could be better directed to some other expenditure or some other program. You end up spending, it takes you longer to take the train than it does your car, and you end up creating a higher carbon footprint than you would if you took your car on that service. There's a good example. A second one is that we're about to go spend $29 billion on a light rail project right now. And what I'm saying to you is that doesn't feel like a good return on investment. This was a government that actually thought spending $800 million on a walking and cycling bridge across the Waitemata Harbour was going to be an excellent idea. So we've got to reprioritise our spending, bring in discipline each year, think about the things that have been working, say we want to do more of that. The things that aren't working, we want to do a lot less of that. And then, so it's just having the financial discipline and doing the same thing in government that New Zealanders are doing across the board as they deal with rising prices on everything. Yes, mate. Oh, sorry.
What are you hoping to see in next month's budget to help New Zealand?
Sorry?
What are you hoping to see in next month's budget to help New Zealand?
Well, what I really want to see is a government that's actually getting its financial books in order. And so, as I said, when the OECD, the Reserve Bank Governor and the National Party now for months have been saying, hey, listen, there's some amber lights coming onto our dash. The world's looking more dangerous, more uncertain. New Zealand's a small economy. We have to get prepared for getting buffeted around a lot more. Let's just get some of those disciplines in place. We're not talking about cutting services or having austerity, but what we're saying is let's be really thoughtful and intentional about that. Because if you don't do it now, and you're seeing inflation take off very quickly, in 12 months and in 24 months, you've got less choices and you've got much harder decisions to make. And so that's why we've been saying now for 4 to 5 months, hey, listen, start adjusting, start thinking about your spending. Sorry, can't hear you? Oh, look, we are of the view that we're going to spend $500 million with management consultants and we're not going to deliver a better or improved health outcome. And instead what we're going to build is a massive amount of bureaucracy. There's no doubt about it. We need to continue to invest in our health service. We need to make sure that we can continue to improve it. Health is one of those areas you want to be constantly doing that, and it's imperfect and there's lots more to do. But causing a massive bureaucracy run out of Wellington isn't going to deliver better outcomes.
Much of the increase is driven by overseas costs, and we're still below average, but below the OECD. Do we have to accept that these factors are out of our control?
I disagree with you completely. If you look at our top 20 trading nations, New Zealand's right up there at the top. And, the Prime Minister and Grant Robertson will try and blame it all on global factors, COVID, the war in Ukraine, a bunch of things. But the reality is Australia's at 3.5%. We're at almost 7% today. We're almost double. Singapore, where the Prime Minister was yesterday, is just at 4%. Where she is today in Japan is at 1%. All of those countries are our big trading partners. They all face the same global factors and they've got very different results because the domestic component of total inflation is very significant. And this government's not controlling the domestic component that they can control.
Would a wealth tax rein in the cost of living?
Look, I think the reality for us, the biggest thing that we have to do right now, and the advice from the OECD and from all the experts is, hey, listen, Grant Robertson, you're addicted to spending. You keep spend, and ultimately you need to get a return for that investment and make sure that that money's working for us really hard. So it's a lot about spending and government spending at the moment.
So not a capital gains tax, you don't think that would have any
No,
impact?
the reality is the government has had a massive increase in government spending since it came to power. The spending is up over 68% since this government came to power. Some of it was necessary, absolutely, with respect to COVID, but there is an assumption that every dollar spent is really wisely spent, and that's not the case. There is good and there is bad spending, and there is wasteful spending, and essentially in times that are tough, like all of us with our own personal budgets, we go back to our expenses, we look at what we can cut out that isn't adding a lot of value, and the government is no different. It just needs to do exactly the same thing.
Do you agree that the cost of living disproportionately affects lower income New Zealanders?
And that's why the cost of living does disproportionately impact lower income people, but it's also impacting tremendously the squeezed middle, who are people who don't get any government assistance or any help. You know, these are people that earn $55,000 to $70,000 a year living in a city like this in Auckland, that you're not a rich person and yet you're a middle average income earner. So they're doing it incredibly tough, because if you've got a $700,000 mortgage over the last year, your interest cost just went up $8,000. If you rent, it's up $150 a week. Food's up, petrol's up. And so the real answer is, if you care deeply about vulnerable people who will be more impacted, you care even more so to make sure the finances are in good shape. Because if you don't, you have to make tougher decisions down the road that could cut services that you desperately want to not cut, so that you can continue to support vulnerable people.
Around 50,000 New Zealanders are expected to leave the country. How would you retain those people?
Well, look, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of young people up and down this country. I was thinking about a couple I met a couple of weeks ago who were trying to build their first home in Pocono. Their build costs had gone up over 20%, and now they were redesigning the house in order to get within their budget again. And the reality is, young people feel like that their wages aren't as high as what they might be in Australia or Canada. The house prices are much more expensive, and ultimately the cost of living is twice as high as it is in Australia. And so as a government, we've got to make sure that this stays a place of opportunity for New Zealanders, so that if you want to make a contribution to your community, if you want to start a business, if you want to raise a family, you're choosing to do it here in New Zealand, because those big macro settings and the economic management of New Zealand, which enables investments in our healthcare system, our education system, is being well managed. And so for me, it gets you back to, well, listen, manage the cost of living crisis, control the things you can control, which is government spending. Really get going on housing, make sure that we can get that supply of houses coming through, and there's a lot of work to be able to do that. And ultimately, how do we improve the productivity or the performance of New Zealand and our businesses so that they can actually lift wages and salaries for everyone? Okay, last question. What's it? That's fine, we'll shoot. You go.
In regards to the health system, would you scrap it if elected, and what would you do instead, because it needs a revamp?
Well, look, as I said, I think our health system is imperfect. It needs constant evolution. It needs consistent improvement in performance. And what we've got to focus on is, what are the health outcomes it's delivering, and are they getting better? And are we delivering more of them for New Zealanders? And so, but my view is creating a Health New Zealand mega authority and mega bureaucracy for a government that's already added 14,000 more bureaucrats at $2 billion, and yet we haven't got better health or education or poverty outcomes, is not the way forward. Yes.
Some companies are
Sorry, can you say that again?
some companies are introducing menstrual leave. Would you support that as a government policy?
I haven't thought too deeply about that. I need to come back to you.
What do you make of Labour turning investor role that's been recently to get out of Parliament?
Oh, I'm not going to comment on the inner workings of the Labour Party. That's for the Prime Minister and others to really think about how they run their caucus and their people. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your time. Take care. Hope you didn't get too